Can a president truly control the independent agencies that shape our economy and daily lives? Or are these critical institutions, like, say, the Federal Reserve, truly beyond their reach?
Yeah, that is the huge question right now. It's driving this really high-stakes legal battle, one that directly impacts presidential power, market stability, and, ultimately your economic future.
Absolutely. And it's not abstract. It's happening right now. We
Hmm.
just saw President Trump move to fire Federal Reserve Governor Lisa Cook, citing alleged mortgage fraud.
Right. And it's important to see this isn't just an isolated incident about one person. It's really part of a much broader push, particularly from the Department of Justice, to fundamentally challenge a 90-year-old Supreme Court ruling. Humphrey's executor.
Humphrey's executor.
Yeah.
Okay, that's the one that's protected these agencies from being fired just at the president's whim, right?
Exactly. It's been the bedrock for nearly a century. But as legal scholars like John Yu have pointed out, the Supreme Court has been, well, chipping away, might be the right phrase, at these protections.
Chipping away.
Yeah.
How so?
Well, starting maybe with less prominent agencies, but now we're seeing this challenge land squarely on really crucial institutions, like the Federal Reserve.
It's a fascinating power struggle. So today, we're going to take a deep dive into these complex constitutional and statutory limitations on presidential power over these independent agencies. We'll be guided by the sources you've shared with us.
Yeah, we'll try to untangle the unitary executive theory, really dissect what for-cause removal means, look at how the Supreme Court's view has been evolving.
And then bring it all home to the Federal Reserve, which seems to be right at the center of this brewing storm.
Okay. So to really get this, we first need to understand a core tension here. It's basically the idea of a unitary executive versus the independence of certain government agencies.
Okay, let's unpack that. First, these independent agencies. We're not talking about, like, the Department of Agriculture or something.
No. We mean specific bodies like the Federal Trade Commission, the FTC, or the Federal Communications Commission, the FCC, and, of course, the Federal Reserve Board.
And what makes them independent?
The key thing is that Congress set them up so their leaders, their heads, can't just be fired by the president whenever they feel like it. They're designed to have some insulation from direct political pressure.
Right. Some breathing room.
Exactly. And that's precisely where this unitary executive theory comes into conflict.
Okay, what's the theory say?
Well, it posits a really strong view of presidential power. Basically that the president has sole authority over the entire executive branch.
Sole authority, meaning direct, hands-on control over everyone exercising executive power.
That's the argument, yeah. Proponents root this in the Constitution itself, Article 2.
Yeah.
They point to the vesting clause, which grants executive power to the president, and the take care clause.
The one that says the president shall take care that the laws be faithfully executed.
Right. So, for advocates of this theory, this means everyone in the executive branch should be directly answerable to the president. It paints a picture of a, quote, hierarchical, unified executive department under the president's command.
And you mentioned groups like the Federalist Society, the Heritage Foundation. They're big proponents of this view.
Yes, they consistently advocate for this strong, unified executive structure.
Okay, so that's the theory. But how does it clash with reality when a president maybe wants to remove someone from one of these independent agencies? That's where the for-cause standard comes in. Right?
Exactly. Because Congress, when setting up these agencies, often put in specific rules about removal. The most common one uses the phrase inefficiency, neglect of duty, or malfeasance in office. We often just call it the INM standard.
INM. Okay.
Yep.
Sounds straightforward enough.
But here's the catch. What INM actually means in practice, that's been unsettled for over a century. It's surprisingly fuzzy.
So it's not as simple as, say, the president doesn't like your latest regulation, you're fired.
Yeah.
Because that wouldn't make them very independent.
No, absolutely not. And the Supreme Court has been pretty clear on that. They've rejected what you might call a maximalist view, where the president could fire someone just for disagreeing on policy. But they also haven't really bought into a super minimalist view either, where removal only happens for, outright bribery or something really extreme.
So there's a middle ground.
That's what many legal scholars argue for. They call it the middle way, or the presidential review approach. And it often focuses on that middle term, neglect of duty.
Neglect of duty. Tell us more about this middle way. What kind of thing would count as neglect of duty, allowing removal, without it just being about politics?
Well, this approach suggests a president could remove a commissioner if they act in a way the president reasonably believes is a sort of clear violation of their statutory job.
Okay, like what?
We're talking about things like egregious errors. Not just making a wrong call, everyone does that, but say repeated or really important, highly consequential mistakes in policy, law, or fact.
So one slip-up probably isn't enough.
Usually not, but a, quote, patent and highly consequential departure from a legal duty. That could do it. Also, think about laws like the Administrative Procedure Act, which prohibits arbitrary action by agencies. If commissioners act arbitrarily, that could be seen as neglect of duty.
Okay, let's try to make this concrete for people listening.
Uh-huh.
A Fed board member just stops showing up to meetings.
That's inefficiency. Pretty clear grounds, yeah.
Or a consumer product safety commissioner gets caught taking a bribe.
Malfeasance. Definitely removable.
And maybe a Social Security commissioner just keeps missing legal deadlines for processing claims.
Classic neglect of duty. These examples seem fairly clear-cut, right?
Yeah, this makes sense.
But the middle way also draws a line. The president can't just fire, say, Nuclear Regulatory Commission members because they issued a regulation the president dislikes, as long as it's within reasonable bounds.
Even if the president really dislikes it.
Even then. Or, removing SEC members for a rule the president questions if the agency's reasoning isn't self-evidently unreasonable. The point is, the I&M standard is meant to be a meaningful restriction. It stops removals based purely on policy disagreements.
So the president does have some supervisory power over these agencies, but it's limited. They can ensure efficiency, make sure duties aren't neglected, stop malfeasance.
Exactly, and make sure agencies act within the law, avoiding unlawful or arbitrary policies. But they can't just dictate policy based on their own preferences or overrule simple disagreements. It's a really fine line.
A fine line, and one the Supreme Court seems to keep redrawing.
Yes, absolutely. The court has been steadily and sometimes quite dramatically recalibrating this balance of power. It hasn't been static at all.
It feels like we need a bit of history here. Back in 1926, there was a case, Myers v. United States.
Right. Myers. That ruling seemed to give presidents a lot of power. It said the president had the exclusive authority to remove executive branch officials, didn't even need Senate approval. Looked like a very strong executive model.
But then, not even 10 years later, 1935, the big one, Humphrey's Executor v. United States.
Ah, yes, Humphrey's Executor. A landmark New Deal case, and it was unanimous. The court held that the president cannot remove officials from what they called quasi-legislative or quasi-judicial agencies without cause.
Quasi-legislative, quasi-judicial, meaning agencies that kind of make rules like Congress or decide cases like courts.
Exactly. Not just agencies carrying out direct presidential orders. This decision was huge. It created that critical limitation, shielding agencies like the FTC from raw political influence. It really laid the foundation for the administrative state as we understand it today.
So for decades, Humphrey's was the bedrock. It built this firewall, sort of.
It did. But more recently, as you said, we've seen the Supreme Court put continuing and newly intense pressure on this whole idea of independent agencies. There's definitely a trend towards strengthening that unitary executive theory again.
The court's been slowly eroding the Humphrey's protections.
You could definitely say that. We saw it in several key cases. Back in 2010, Free Enterprise Fund v. Public Company Accounting Oversight Board. That case struck down statutes that had 2 layers of removal protection.
2 layers. Like, the president needed cause, and then someone else needed cause to remove that person.
Something like that. The court basically said, look, that's too much insulation. It unconstitutionally hinders the president's ability to oversee the executive branch.
And it didn't stop there. 2020, SELA Law, LLC, Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. That sounds important.
Very important. The court ruled Congress couldn't shield a single powerful director, like the head of the CFPB, from at-will presidential removal. And significantly, Justices Thomas and Gorsuch actually wrote separately to say they wanted to overturn Humphrey's executor entirely.
Wow, so explicitly calling for its end. That shows a real philosophical shift, or at least a deep division on the court.
Absolutely. A profound statement about preferring presidential control. And then, just a year later, Collins v. Yellen extended that SELA law logic to another agency, the Federal Housing Finance Agency.
And even more recently, Trump v. Wilcox.
Right, earlier this year. The court essentially greenlit President Trump's dismissal of a National Labor Relations Board member. Interestingly, though, the court did describe the Federal Reserve Board as, quote, a uniquely structured entity.
Uniquely structured. What does that mean? The possible exception.
Well, it hinted that maybe, just maybe, the Fed might retain more protection than these other agencies. But legal scholars like John Yoo find that distinction pretty shaky. They argue if the principle is presidential supervision, why would the Fed be different?
Which leads us right back to the current administration's actions. You mentioned the Department of Justice.
Yes. The DOJ, through the acting solicitor general, has been openly challenging statutes that prohibit at-will firing. They're targeting protections for the FTC, the NLRB, the Consumer Product Safety Commission.
As their argument is.
Their claim is that Humphrey's executor itself unconstitutionally prevents the president from adequately supervising principal officers. It's a direct challenge to that foundational precedent.
A direct assault. And the Federal Reserve seems to be the main battleground now.
It really does feel like the test case for this whole debate.
And this isn't just legal theory anymore. We know President Trump, during his term, publicly pressured Fed Chair Jerome Powell over interest rates. He wanted lower rates. And he tried to appoint people to the Fed board who agreed with him.
Exactly. That history sets the stage for the current situation, the attempt to fire Federal Reserve Governor Lisa Cook over these alleged mortgage fraud charges.
So the administration's argument here is that cause for removal under the statute is subjective, and something like alleged fraud clearly counts as legitimate cause serving the national interest.
That's the line. And legal scholars who support this view, like Josh Hammer, argue that if Fed governors can't be removed by the president, then the Fed itself is unconstitutionally structured.
Because Fed governors wield so much power,
Right.
affecting the economy, interest rates, the dollar's value.
Right. Hammer and others say that's clearly executive power. And from that perspective, the president, who voters hold accountable, needs direct control over how that power is used. It becomes an argument about democratic accountability, making sure the person in charge of the economy is answerable to the people.
Okay, but then you have the critics, and they sound some pretty loud alarm bells about the potential economic fallout if the Fed loses its independence.
Oh, absolutely. Some incredibly serious warnings. One of the biggest fears is hyperinflation.
Hyperinflation, how?
The worry is that if politicians control interest rates directly, they'll be tempted to keep rates artificially low,
Yeah.
to boost the economy before an election, maybe. That could flood the market with easy money, causing prices to spiral out of control.
Is there precedent for that?
Well, critics point to the 1970s in the U.S. when political influence over the Fed was arguably stronger, and we had stagflation, that nasty mix of high inflation and a stagnant economy. And internationally, Turkey is often brought up today as an example where political interference in central banking seems linked to severe inflation problems. It's a cautionary tale.
A stark warning, yeah. What else are critics worried about?
Another huge one is market confidence. Think about it. If businesses, investors, even regular households lose faith that the Fed can keep inflation stable,
It happens then.
well, it could lead to much higher long-term interest rates. Mortgages get more expensive. Business loans cost more. It slows everything down, and it could weaken the dollar.
Meaning our money buys less overseas, imports cost more.
Exactly. And remember, the U.S. relies heavily on foreign investors buying our bet to finance government deficits. If those investors start worrying that the U.S. might just try to inflate its way out of its debt, basically, devalue the debt by letting inflation run wild, they might pull back. That could trigger a really damaging dollar and bond market crisis.
And you mentioned some troubling signs already. Dollar depreciation, gold prices rising.
Some analysts point to things like a 10% drop in the dollar's value recently, or a 45% jump in gold prices, as possible signals of market nervousness about the future direction of economic management. Gold is often seen as a hedge against inflation and instability.
Beyond inflation and market confidence, what other concerns are raised?
There's the fundamental worry about politicizing expert decisions. Monetary policy is complex. It requires deep, expert economic judgment, not really partisan decision-making. Critics warn that letting politics drive those decisions could lead to, well, disastrous results.
And finally, a broader point about the rule of law.
Yeah, the idea that threatening officials, potentially even with criminal probes, simply to settle policy disagreements, critics argue that's an abuse of the justice system, and practically it might scare off good, competent people from wanting to take these important public service jobs in the first place if they fear becoming political targets.
It seems like the Senate has a pretty crucial role here too, doesn't it, in confirming appointments?
Absolutely. The Senate's confirmation process is a vital check. By carefully scrutinizing who the president appoints to the Federal Reserve Board, they can try to ensure that nominees are genuinely committed to the Fed's independence and its mandate, not just political loyalty. It's a really important, though maybe sometimes overlooked, part of preserving that balance.
So let's try to recap this deep dive. We've really explored this fundamental tension, haven't we, between the idea of a strong, unified presidency and the need for independence in certain key agencies.
Yeah, we traced how the Supreme Court's thinking has shifted over time, especially with this recent chipping away at the Humphreys executor precedent.
And we've seen how this is playing out right now with the Federal Reserve, which is absolutely central to our economy. It's not just an academic debate about constitutional clauses anymore.
Not at all. It's a fundamental question about who ultimately controls major aspects of governance in our modern state. Who holds the reins?
Exactly. And as these lines of authority keep getting debated and potentially redrawn, it really leaves us all with a provocative thought, doesn't it? What is the right balance? How do we weigh presidential accountability to voters against the need for expert, independent decision-making in agencies that have such a huge impact on your daily life, on the nation's financial stability?
Finding that balance,
Yeah.
it's a core challenge for how our government works, and one we'll undoubtedly be grappling with for a long time to come.